Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Old-Fashioned Ghost Stories. Volume 1, Story 1, The Green Bank Hotel, Bardsley. One afternoon in July of this year, I took tea with Lady B at her club in the West End. Lady B is a very old friend of mine. Our friendship dating back to the days when I wore Eton collars and a preparatory school cap. She was in unusually high spirits at the thought of a cruise in the Baltic, while I was equally exuberant at being once again in London after a very trying sojourn in a particularly remote and isolated town. A town renowned for pilchards, pasties, and painters. Now, there is nothing mean nor petty about Lady B. She is generosity itself, so kind, so courteous, and withal so daintily pretty, that to be near her even is to be an Elysium. Remembering the interest I had always taken in matters psychical, she had invited several friends especially to meet me, and it was from one of them, Miss Charlotte Napier, that I heard the following story. Chancing to be stranded late one night at Bardsley, she began. Owing to a slight miscalculation of the timetable, I had no other resource than to put up at the Green Bank Hotel in Russell Street. It was a very ordinary hotel, ordinary both in accommodation and appearance. One part of it, that in which I slept, possibly dated back to the Elizabethan period, but the rest, most hideously renovated, was quite modern. Outside my room, number 56, was a long and somewhat gloomy corridor connecting the old and new portions of the house. I retired to rest about 11, closing time, and had been asleep barely an hour before I woke with a start to find the room flooded with a pale phosphorescent light. The moon shone through my window panes. It gleamed with an unearthly whiteness across the bed, and thence across the room, glancing upon the panels of the door in such a manner that I was constrained to follow its course and to fix my gaze wherever it shone. The door was a mass of light. I could see each crack and scar upon it, even the fingerprints on the white handle, with painful distinctness. A sudden sensation of horror overcame me. I would have given anything to have been able to look elsewhere. I could not. All my senses were centered upon the door. It enchained me, it drew me, and as I gazed at it in helpless awe, the sound of footsteps from without suddenly broke upon my ears. Instantly, all my faculties were on the alert, and I became the victim of a curious sensation unlike any I had hitherto experienced, but which I have since learned is a usual effect of psychic manifestation. I felt the proximity of the unnatural. An icy coldness stole down my back. My teeth chattered, my hair seemed to rise on end. The violent palpitation of my heart made me sick and dizzy. My faculties had indeed become abnormally acute, but my body seemed no longer alive, and I knew that whatever happened, I should be absolutely incapable of action. My powerlessness was soon to be put to the test. Sitting bolt upright in bed, in obedience to an irresistible impulse, I listened with all my might. What were those sounds? They were certainly unlike any I had ever heard before, and the kind of terror that imparted was hitherto unknown to me. Perhaps the nearest semblance to the kind of fear I then felt is the fear inspired by the thought of a lunatic. I could not stir. I could only wait and listen. The unnatural nature of the footsteps was emphasized by the brilliancy of the moonlight, quite an abnormal feature in itself, and the intense hush which, stealing surreptitiously upon the house, obliterated every other sound. The footsteps gradually became interpretive. Two people were rushing headlong down the corridor. From the light flying footsteps of the foremost and the heavier tread and ever-increasing tread of the hindermost, I concluded it was a race entailing vital consequences, and that the fugitives would soon be caught. Caught, but not, pray heaven, at my door. What on earth had happened? What could happen in a well-regulated hotel? Fire, robbery, or murder? Murder. Great drops of sweat broke out on my brow at the bare thought. The moon shone in wider and more coldly than ever, while the steps drew nearer and nearer, so near in fact that I fancied I could detect the sound of breathing. Short, sharp-drawn gasps of agony accompanied by easier and more strenuous inhalations. Who were the actors in this invisible drama? Were they both men? I imagined not. Indeed, 1,000 horrible ideas suggested themselves to my mind, to be interrupted by a terrific crash on the upper panels of the door that made me all but die with terror. Never had I suffered as at that moment. I strove to scream. It was in vain. My tongue clave to the roof of my mouth. I could utter no sound. The door, which I had taken the precaution to lock, was unceremoniously burst open, and into the room rushed a very young and fragile-looking man, clad in the costume of a cavalier of the time of Naseby, while close at his heels there followed a gigantic Roundhead, armed with all the terrible paraphernalia of war. The tableau was so totally different from anything I had anticipated, and withal horribly real, so real that, had it been in my power, I must inevitably have raised a hand to interpose. Indeed, the wretched fugitive made straight for my bed, and falling on his knees beside it, clutched the counterpane convulsively in his fingers. His ashy face was so near mine that I not only saw every feature in it with damning clearness, but I read the many varied expressions in his eyes. They were awful. I read in them despair, terror, hate, overshadowed in the background by an insatiable craving for every imaginable vice. Yet they were beautiful eyes, beautiful both in formation and color, too effeminately beautiful for a man. His hair, which fell in a wild profusion of ringlets over forehead and shoulders, was of a rich chestnut hue, and most luxuriant. He wore neither beard nor mustache. He was absolutely clean-shaven, and his skin shone with all the milky whiteness of that of a young woman. His features were neatly molded and extremely delicate. His hands, well-shaped and narrow, while his fingers, long and tapering, were crowned with pellucid filbert nails. Attired in the most costly and elegant manner, a manner that suggested the court fop rather than the soldier, he formed in every way a marked contrast to his Puritan pursuer. The Roundhead was a huge brawny fellow, dressed in a leather jerkin and heavy riding boots, his soiled and muddy clothes betokening the wear and tear of an arduous campaign. His face, always ugly and naturally perhaps sullen and forbidding, was now positively diabolical, rage, hatred, and triumph vying with one another for supremacy. Catching hold of the cavalier by silken tresses and pulling back his head by brute force, the Cromwellian slowly and deliberately drew the keen blade of his knife across the doomed man's throat. The horrid deed, transacted amid the most preternatural silence, was perpetrated so close to me that I was obliged to witness every revolting detail, and although I felt sure the victim was bad and vicious, I did not think the vileness of his character in any way justified the atrocity of his assassin. The murderer had barely accomplished his fiendish design before a deadly sickness came over me, and I fainted. On recovering consciousness, the room was once again in darkness, nor could I discover in the morning any sign whatever of the awful tragedy. On making inquiries in the town, I learned that the inn was well known to be haunted, other people as well as I having witnessed the same phenomena, and that during the recent renovations a skeleton had been unearthed at the foot of the main staircase. I saw it in the local museum, and instantly identified the costume it wore as the one I had seen on the hapless fugitive. But the skeleton was that of a woman. Next story. Southgate Street, Bristol, the notorious servant who answers the door. In the spring of 1899, being then a member of a certain psychical research group, and hearing that a ghost had been seen at a certain house on Southgate Street, Bristol, I set off to interview the ladies who were reported to have seen it. I found them, the Misses Rood, at home, and on their very graciously consenting to relate to me their psychical experiences, I sat and listened to the following story, told as nearly as possible in the eldest lady's own words. It is now, she began, some 10 years since we were the tenants of the house you mention, but I recollect what I saw there as vividly as if it were yesterday. The house, I must tell you, is very small. Only 8 or so rooms, dingy and in a chronic state of dilapidation. It stands in the middle of a terrace with no front garden to speak of, save a few yards of moss-covered tiles, slate-colored and broken, while its back windows overlooked a dreary expanse of deep and silent water. Nothing more dismal could be imagined. Still, when we took it The idea of it being haunted never for one instant entered our minds, and our first intimation that such was the case came upon us like a thunderbolt. We only kept one maid, Jane, a girl with dark hair and pleasant manners. My sisters and I doing all the cooking and helping with the light work. The morning on which incident number 1 happened, knowing Jane to be upstairs occupied in dusting the rooms and my sisters being out, my mother asked me to go into the kitchen and see if the stove was all right, as there was a smell of burning. Doing as she bid, I hastened to the kitchen, where a strange spectacle met my sight. Kneeling in front of the stove, engaged apparently in polishing the fender, was a servant girl with red hair. I started back in astonishment. Who could she be? Too intent to first notice my advent, she kept on her work, giving me time to observe that she was wearing a very dirty dress, and that her rag of a cap was quite askew. Satisfied she was not Jane, and wondering whether someone else's maid had mistaken our kitchen for her own, the houses in the terrace being all alike, I called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" Whereupon, dropping the fire irons with a clatter, she quickly turned around, displaying an ashen pale face, the expression on which literally froze me with horror. Never, never had I seen such an awful look of hopeless, of desperate, of diabolical abandonment in anyone's eyes as in those of hers when their glance met mine. For some seconds we glared at one another without moving, and then, still regarding me with a furtive look from out of the corner of her horrible eyes, she slowly rose from the hearth and, gliding stealthily forward, disappeared in the diminutive scullery opposite. Curiosity, now overcoming fear, I at once followed. She was nowhere to be seen, nor was there any other mode of exit by which she could have made her departure than a tiny window, some 4 feet or so from the floor, and directly overlooking the deep waters of the pond to which I have already alluded. Here, then, was a mystery. What had I seen? Had I actually encountered a phantasm, or was I but the victim of an exceedingly unpleasant and falsidical hallucination? I preferred to think the former. Not wishing to frighten my mother, I intended keeping the incident to myself, writing, however, a complete account of it in my diary for the current year. But a further incident, occurring to my youngest sister within the next few days, I determined to reveal what I had seen and compare notes. The eldest Mrs. Rood now concluded, and on my expressing a desire to hear more, her youngest sister very obligingly commenced. "I had been out shopping in the Triangle one morning," she said, "and having omitted to take the latchkey, I was obliged to ring. Jane answered the summons. There was nothing, of course, unusual in this, as it was her duty to do so, but there was something extremely singular in what happened at her elbow. Standing close beside, I might almost say leaning against her, though Jane was apparently unaware of it, was a very strange servant girl with red hair, and the most uncanny eyes. She had on a bedraggled print dress and a cap all askew, but it was her expression that most attracted my attention. It was horrid. 'Oh, Jane,' I cried, 'whoever is it with you?' Following the direction of my gaze, Jane immediately turned around and without a word fainted. That is all. The apparition, or whatever you may please to call it, vanished, and the next time I saw it, it was under different circumstances." "Will you be so kind as to relate them?" I inquired. Miss Rood proceeded. "Oh, it is nothing very much," she exclaimed. "Only it was very unpleasant at the time, especially as I was all alone. You see, Mother, being delicate, went to bed early. My sisters were at a concert, and it was Jane's night out. I never somehow fancied the basement of the house. It was so cold and damp, reminding me not a little of a morgue or charnel house. Consequently, I never stayed there a moment longer than was absolutely necessary. And on this night in question, I was in the act of scurrying back to the drawing-room, when a gentle tap-tap at the scullery window made me defer my departure. Entering the back kitchen, somewhat timidly I admit, I saw a face peering in at me through the tiny window. Though the night was dark and there was no artificial lighting, at this side of the house, every feature of that face was revealed to me as clearly as if it had been day. The little untidy cap, all awry, surmounting the shock head of red hair, now half down and dripping with water, the ghastly white cheeks, the widely open mouth, and the eyes, their pupils abnormally dilated and full of lurid light, were most appallingly horrible than ever. I stood and gazed at her, my heart sick with terror, nor do I know what would have happened to me Had not the loud rap of the postman acted like magic. The thing vanished, and turning tail, I fled upstairs into the presence of my mother. That is all. I was profuse in my thanks, and the third Miss Rood then spoke. My bedroom, she began, was on the top landing, the window overlooking the water. I slept alone some months after the anecdotes just related, and was awakened one night by feeling some disgusting wet object lying on my forehead. With an ejaculation of alarm, I attempted to brush it aside, and opening my eyes encountered a ghastly white face bending right over me. I instantly recognized it by the description my sisters had given as the phantasm of the red-headed girl. The eyes were terrible. Shifting its slimy hand on my forehead and brandishing it aloft like some murderous weapon, it was about to clutch my throat when human nature would stand it no longer, and I fainted. On recovering, I found both my sisters in the room, and after that I never slept by myself. Did your mother ever see it? I asked. Frequently, the eldest Miss Rood replied, and it was chiefly on her account we relinquished our tenancy. Her nervous system was completely prostrated. Other people saw the ghost beside us, the youngest Miss Rood interrupted. For not only did the long succession of maids after Jane all see it, but many of the subsequent tenants. The house was never let for any length of time. Then perhaps it is empty now? I asked, in which case I shall most certainly experiment there. This proved to be the case. The house was tenantless, and I easily prevailed upon the agent to loan me the key. But the venture was fruitless. 3 of us and a dog undertook it. We sat at the foot of the gloomy staircase. 12 o'clock struck, no ghost appeared. The dog became a nuisance, and we came away disgusted. A one-night's test, however, is no test at all. There is no reason to suppose apparitions are always to be seen by man, as yet we know nothing, absolutely nothing, of the powers or conditions regulating their appearance, and it is surely feasible that the unknown controlling elements of one night may have been completely altered, may even have ceased to exist by the next. At all events, that was my opinion. I was by no means daunted at a single failure, but it was impossible to get anyone to accompany me. The skeptic is so boastfully eager by day. Ghosts, he sneers. What are ghosts? Indigestion and imagination. I'll challenge you to show me the house. I wouldn't sleep in alone. Ghost indeed. Give me a poker or a shovel and I will scare away the lot of them. And when you do show him the house, he always has a prior engagement, or else the weather is too cold, or he has too much work to do next day, or if it really isn't worth the trouble, or, well, he's sure to have some very plausible excuse. At least that has been my invariable experience. There is no greater coward than the skeptic, and so, unable to procure a friend for the occasion, I did without one. Neither did I have the key of the house, but, taking French leave, gained admittance through a window. It was horribly dank and lonely, and although on the former occasion I did not feel the presence of the superphysical, I did so now. The very moment I crossed the threshold, striking a light, I looked around me. I was in the damp and moldy den that served as a kitchen. Outside I saw the moon reflected on the black and silent water. A long and sleek cockroach disappeared leisurely in a hole in the skirting as I flashed my light in its direction, and I thought I detected the movement of a rat or some large animal in the cupboard at the foot of the stairs. I forthwith commenced a search. The cupboard was empty. I must have been mistaken. For some minutes I stood in no perplexity as to my next move. Where should I go? Where ought I to go if my adventure was to prove successful? I glanced at the narrow, tortuous staircase, winding upwards into the grim possibilities of the deserted hall and landings, and my courage failed. Here, at least, I was safe. Should the unknown approach me, I could escape by the same window through which I had entered. I felt I dare not. I really could not go any further. Seized with a sudden panic at nothing more substantial than my own thoughts, I was groping my way backwards to the window when a revulsion of feeling made me pause. If all men were poltroons, how much more humanity ever know of the occult? We should leave off where we began, and it had been my ambition to go further. My self-respect returning, I felt in my pocket for pencil, notebook, and revolver, and trimming my lamp, I mounted the stairs. A house of such minute dimensions did not take long to explore. What rooms there were Lilliputian, mere boxes, The walls from which hung the tattered remnants of the most offensively inartistic papers were too obviously jerry-built. The wainscoting was scarred, the beading broken, not a door fitted, not a window that was not either loose or sashless. The entire house was rotten, paltry, mean. I would not have had it as a gift. But where could I wait to see the ghost? Disgust at my surroundings had for a time made me forget my fears. These now returned reinforced. I thought of Miss Root's comparison with the morgue, and shuddered. The rooms looked ghastly. Selecting the landing at the foot of the upper story, I sat down my back against the wall and waited. Confronting me was a staircase leading up and down, equally dark, equally ghostly. On my right was what might once have been the drawing room, but was now a grim conglomeration of bare boards and moonlight. And on my left was an open window, directly overtopping the broad expanse of colorless, motionless water. 12 o'clock struck. The friendly footsteps of a pedestrian died away in the distance. I was now beyond the pale of assistance, alone and deserted. Deserted by all save the slimy, creeping insects below and the shadows. Yes, the shadows. And as I watched them, sporting fantastically at my feet, I glanced into the darkness beyond and shivered. All was now intensely suggestive, and still the road alone attractive. And despite my Spartanic resolution, I would have given much to be put out in the open. The landing was so cramped, so hopeless. A fresh shadow, the shadow of a leaf that had hitherto escaped my notice, now attracted and appalled me. The scratching of an insect made my heart stand still. My sight and hearing were painfully acute. A familiar and sickly sensation gradually crept over me. The throbbing of my heart increased. The most inconceivable and desperate terror laid hold of me. The house was no longer empty. The supernatural had come. Something, I knew not what, I dare not think what, was below, and I knew it would ascend. All the ideas I had previously entertained of addressing the ghost and taking notes were entirely annihilated by my fear. Fear mingled with a horrible wonder as to what form the apparition would take, and I found myself praying heaven it might not be that of an elemental. The thing had now crossed the hall. I knew this somehow instinctively, and was beginning to mount the stairs. I could not cry out. I could not stir. I could not close my eyes. I could only sit there staring at the staircase in the most awful of dumb, apprehensive agonies. The thing drew nearer, nearer, up, up, up. It came until I could see it at last. See the shock head of red hair, the white cheeks, the pale staring eyes, all rendered hideously ghastly by the halo of luminous light that played around it. This was a ghost, an apparition, a bona fide phantasm of the dead. Without any display of physical power, it overcame me. Happily for me, the duration of its passage was brief. It came within a yard of me, the water dripping from its clinging clothes, yet leaving no marks on the floor. It thrust its face forward. I thought it was going to touch me, and tried to shrink away from it, but could not. Yet it did nothing but stare at me, and its eyes were all the more horrible because they were blank. Not diabolical, as Miss Root had described them, but simply blank. Blank with the glassiness of the dead. Gliding past with a slightly swaying motion, it climbed upstairs, the night air blowing through the bedraggled dress in a horribly natural manner. I watched it till it was out of sight with bated breath. For a second or so it stopped irresolutely beside an open window. There was a slight movement as of someone mounting the sill, a mad, hilarious chuckle, a loud splash, and then silence, after which I went home. I subsequently discovered that early in the 70s a servant girl who was in service at that house had committed suicide in the manner I have just described. But whether or not she had red hair, I have never been able to be ascertained. P.S. The ghost, I am informed on very reliable authority, is still, as of August 1908, to be seen inside the house. Next story. Mulready Villa near Basingstoke, the Black Clock. When I was reading for the Royal Irish Constabulary at that excellent and ever popular Queen's Service Academy in Dublin, I made many friends among my fellow students, certain of whom it has been my good fortune to meet in afterlife. Quite recently, for example, while on a visit of enjoyment to London, I ran up against T at Daly's Theatre. T, one of the best-hearted fellows who ever trod in Ely Square, passed in second for the Royal Irish Constabulary and is now a district inspector in some outlandish village in Connemara. And again, a summer or two ago when I was on the pier at Bournemouth, I plumped myself down in a seat next to G, who, although never a very great friend of mine, I was uncommonly glad to see under the circumstances. But last year, I was unusually lucky, chancing to find a passenger on the same boat as myself, Harry O'More, one of my very best chums, from whom I learned the following story. You must know, he began, as we sat on a deck watching the lofty outlines of St. David's Head slowly fade in the distance. You must know, O'Donnell, that after leaving Crawley's, I inherited a nice little sum of money from my aunt, Lady Morgan, of Blackrock, who, dying quite unexpectedly, left the bulk of her property to my family. My brother Bob had her estate in Roscommon, Charlie the house near Dublin, while I, lucky beggar that I am, for I was head over heels in debt at the time, suddenly found myself the happy possessor of £20,000 and a bog oak grandfather clock. Here, I thought fit to interrupt. A bog oak clock? I exclaimed. Good gracious me, what a funny legacy. Had you taken a fancy to it? I had never ever seen it. O'More laughed. Then, looking serious, said, My Aunt O'Donnell, as I dare say you recollect, was a rather dry and satirical person. The clock has not been exactly a pleasant acquisition to my establishment, so I fancy she may have bequeathed it to me as a sort of antidote to the exhilarating effect of £20,000. A sort of bitter with the sweet, don't you know? You appear astonished. You would like to hear more about the clock? And you are quite right, too. The history of a really antique piece of furniture is a million times more interesting a subject to discuss than a ton of gold. To begin with, it was almost as new to my aunt as to me. She had only had it a week before she died, and during that brief interval she had made up her mind to leave it to me. Odd, was it not? I thought so too at her funeral. Now it seems quite natural. I was her metaphysician. I knew her and understood her idiosyncrasies better than most people. She bought the clock for a mere song from a second-hand furniture dealer in Grafton Street. I was living at the time near Basingstoke in a small house, one of those horrible acronyms, an up-to-date villa in the old world village. It's a charming neighborhood. Suited me down to the ground. Flat country, hills tire me to death. Excellent roads. I am fond of riding. Trout streams, pretty meadows, crowds of honeysuckle, and that sort of thing. And, to crown all else, pines. Now, if there is one scent for which I have a special weakness, it is that of the pine. I could sit out of doors ad infinitum sniffing pines. It intoxicates me, hence I grew very fond of Hampshire. Let me return to the clock. It came from Dublin to Bristol via the good old Argo. What Bristolian is there, I should like to know. Who doesn't love the Argo? And thence by rail to Basingstoke, arriving at my house after dusk. You see, I am talking of it almost as if it were some live person. But then, you see, it was a bog oak grandfather's clock. No common grinder, I can assure you. And I was prepared to pay it every homage the moment it was landed in the hall. The carter, however, was by no means so enamored of it. He was a rough, churlish fellow. What British workman is not? If you take my advice, mister, he growled, you'll pitch the hempish thing in someone else's garden right away. How characteristic of the charitable Briton. I gently rebuked the irate man. Of course, he could afford to be more prodigal with his belongings than I. With evident haste, and still muttering angrily, he went, and I called to my housekeeper, Mrs. Partridge, and we examined the heirloom together. It certainly was a most imposing piece of furniture, standing at least 8 feet high, with a face large in proportion. It towered above me like a giant. I can't describe to you how black. It was black as ebony and shining. I asked Mrs. Partridge how she liked it, for, to tell you the truth, there was something so indefinably queer about it that I began to wonder if the carter had spoken the truth. It is truly magnificent, she said, running her hand over its polished surface. I have never seen so fine a piece of workmanship. It will be the making of this hall, but it reminds me of a hearse. We laughed. The analogy was simply ludicrous. A grandfather's clock and a hearse, but then it told the time. And time is sometimes represented in the guise of death. Father Death with his sickle. My laughter left me and I shivered. We placed the clock in the right-hand corner of the hall, opposite the front door, so that everyone coming to the house could see it, and, as we anticipated, it was much admired. So much admired, in fact, that I became quite jealous. Jealous, and of a clock. How very singular. But then I recollected. I was engaged, and of course I resented my fiancée taking notice of anyone or anything save myself. Like all the other visitors, however, she never passed by the clock without pausing to look at it. "I can't help it," she whispered. Its size. It's stupendous. It quite fills the house. There's hardly any room to breathe. It's a monstrous clock. It fascinates me. It's more than a clock. You must get rid of it." Abbess was whimsical. "What? Get rid of the ebony clock? Impossible." The idea tickled me. I laughed. I laughed then, but not later, when she had gone and all was quiet. From the hall below I heard it strike 1, 2, 3, 12. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull ponderous clang, and the sound that came from its brazen lungs, though, had loud, deep, and musical notes. It was far too thrilling. Against my will it made me think, and my thoughts were none too pleasant. Hardly had its vibrations ceased before I sat up in bed and listened. At first I attributed the noise I had heard to the pulsations of my heart. Bump, bump, bump. But as I crouched there waiting, I was soon undeceived. The sounds not only increased in intensity but drew nearer. Bump, bump, bump. Just as if something huge and massive was moving across the hall floor and ascending the stairs. An icy fear stole all over me. What in heaven's name could it be? I glanced in terror at the door. It was locked and bolted. The village was much frequented by tramps, and I always went to bed prepared. But this noise, this series of heavy mechanical booms, this could never be attributed to any burglar. It reached the top of the staircase. It pounded down the passage leading to my room, and then, with a most terrific crash, it fell against my door. I was spellbound, petrified. I could not move. It was the clock, the gigantic monstrous clock, the funereal hideous clock. I heard it ticking. The suspicions that I entertained all along with regard to it were now confirmed. It lived. That was no ordinary striking. This was no ordinary ticking. The thing breathed. It spoke. It laughed in some diabolically ghoulish manner. I would have sacrificed my house and fortune to have been able to reach the bell. I could not. I could do nothing but sit there listening to its mocking voice. The minutes passed by slowly. Never had I had the leisure to count them with such painful accuracy, for the tickings, though of equal duration, varied most alarmingly in intonation. This horrible farce lasted without cessation, till one apparently convinced of its inability to gain admittance, it gave an extra loud and emphatic clang, and took its departure. In the morning it was standing as usual in the corner of the hall, nor could I detect the slightest evidence of animation, neither in its glassy face nor in its sepulchral tone. Happening to pass by at that instant, Mrs. Partridge surprised me in my act of examination, and from her ashy cheeks and frightened glance, I concluded she, too, had heard the noises and had rightly guessed their origin. Nor was I mistaken. From putting a few leading questions to her, she reluctantly admitted she had heard everything. "But," she whispered, "I have kept it from the maids, for if once they get hold of the idea the house is haunted, they will leave tomorrow." Unfortunately, her circumspection proved of no avail. Night after night, the clock repeated its vagaries, bumping on the staircase and passages, to such a degree that the noise not only awakened the entire household, but aroused general suspicion. Nor were its attentions any longer restricted to me. It gradually extended the length of its wanderings till every part of the house had been explored and every door visited. The maids now complained to me. They could not do their work, they argued, if they were deprived of sleep, and sleep was out of the question while the disturbances continued. I must get rid of the clock. To this proposition, however, I was by no means agreeable. I certainly had no reason to like the clock. Indeed, I loathed and hated it. But in some indefinable manner it fascinated me. I dare not part with it. I have no doubt, I protested, that annoyances will cease as soon as the clock has become at home with its surroundings. Have patience, and all will be well. They agreed to wait a little longer before giving me notice, and I fully hoped that my prophecy would be fulfilled. But the clock was far more persistent than I had anticipated. Adopting fresh tactics, it began a series of persecutions that speedily brought matters to a crisis. Christina the cook was the first victim. Not being a very fluent scribe, her letters caused her endless labor, and she often sat up writing long after the other servants had gone to bed. On the night in question, she was plodding on wearily when the intense stillness of the house made her suddenly think of the time. It must be very late. Dare she venture in the hall? Christina was not a nervous woman. She had hitherto discredited all ghost stories, and was quite the last person in the house to accept the theory that the present disturbances were due to any superphysical agency. She now, however, recollected all that had been said on the subject, and the close proximity of the clock filled her with dread, her fears being further augmented by the knowledge of her isolation. Unluckily, her room was completely cut off from any other in the house. Hastily putting away her writing materials, she was preparing to make a precipitate rush for the stairs when a peculiar thumping riveted her attention. Her blood congealed, her legs tottered. She could not move an inch. What was it? Her heart. Only the pulsations of her heart. She burst out laughing. How truly ridiculous! Catching her breath, and casting fearful looks of apprehension on all sides, she advanced towards the stairs and, tiptoeing stealthily across the hall, tried in vain to keep her eyes from the clock. But its sonorous ticking brought her to a peremptory halt. She stood and listened. Tick, tick, tick. It was so unlike any other ticking she had ever heard, it appalled her. The clock, too, seemed to have become blacker and even more gigantic. It reared itself above her like a monstrous coffin. She was now too terrified to think of escape, and could only clutch hold of the banisters in momentary terror of some fresh phenomena. In this helpless condition she watched the clock slowly increase in stature, till the grotesquely carved summit all but swept the ceiling, while a pair of huge, toeless, gray feet protruded from beneath its base. Nor were these the only changes, for during their accomplishment others of an equally alarming nature had taken place, and the ticking, after having passed through any transitional stage, was now replaced by a spasmodic breathing, forcibly suggestive of something devilish and bestial. At this juncture, words cannot convey any idea of what Christina suffered, nor had she seen the worst. Midnight at length came. In dumb agony she watched, the minute hand slowly making its last circuit. There were 5 frantic clangs. The door concealing the pendulum flew open, and an enormous hand, ashy gray, with long, mouse-shaped fingers, made a convulsive grab at her. Swinging to one side, she narrowly avoided capture, and glancing upward saw something so diabolically awful that her heart turned to ice. The face of the clock had disappeared, and in its place Christina saw a frightful head, gray and evil. It was very large and round, half human, half animal, and wholly beastly, with abnormally long, lidless eyes of pale blue that leered at the affrighted girl in the most sinister manner. Such a creature must have owed its origin to hell. For some seconds she stared at it, too enthralled with horror even to breathe, and then, a sudden movement on its part, breaking the spell, she regained control over her limbs and fled for her life. Christina reported all this to me the next morning. She had narrowly escaped capture by darting through the front door, which someone, fortunately for her, had forgotten to bolt. She had not returned to the house, but had instead passed the rest of the night in a neighboring cottage. I won't, under any circumstances, sir, she added, sleep here again. Indeed, I could not, because I can't abide the presence of that clock. I shan't feel easy until I'm miles away from it, in some big town where the bustle and noise of life may help me forget it, and she shuddered. Partly as a compensation for what she had undergone, and partly to avoid a scandal, I presented her with a substantial check. Despite Mrs. Partridge's pleadings, I kept the clock. I could not, I dare not, part with it. It was my aunt's bequest. It fascinated me. Do you understand, O'Donnell? It fascinated me. But I did make one concession. I permitted them to remove it to the summer house. My first care now was to see that all the doors were locked and windows bolted before retiring to bed, a precaution that was speedily justified. For the next few nights after the removal of the clock, I was awakened about 12 by a violent ringing of the front door bell, while a heavy crunching of the gravel beneath my window informed me our persecutor was trying to gain admittance. These nocturnal disturbances ceasing, I began to congratulate myself upon having seen the last of the hauntings, when a rumor reached me that the clock had actually begun to infest the more lonely of the lanes and byroads. Nor did the report, as the sequel would show, long remain unverified. My Uncle John, a rare old sport, came to stay with me. He arrived about 10, and we had not yet gone to bed when the vicar of the parish burst into our presence in the greatest state of agitation. "I must apologize for this late visit," he gasped, sinking into an easy chair. "I couldn't get here before. Indeed, I did not intend calling this evening, and would not have done so but for an extraordinary incident that has just happened. Would you think it very unclerical if I were to ask you for a glass of neat brandy?" I glanced at him in ill-disguised terror. His blanched cheeks and trembling hands told their own tale. He had seen the clock. "Thanks awfully," he said, replacing the empty glass on the table. "I feel better now, but, by Jove, it did unnerve me. Let me tell you from the beginning. I have been calling at Gillett's farm, which, as you know, is 2 or more miles from here, and the night being fine, I decided to go home by the fields. Well, all was right till I got to a little spinney lying at the foot of Dixon Hollow. Even in broad daylight, I always feel a trifle apprehensive before entering it, as it is often frequented by tramps and other doubtful characters. In fact, there isn't a more murderous-looking spot in the county. All was so still, so unusually still, I thought, and the shadows so incomprehensible, that I had half a mind to retrace my steps, but disliking to appear cowardly and remembering, I must confess, that I had ordered a roast duck for supper, I climbed the wooden fence and plunged into the copse. At every step, silence increased, the cracking of twigs under my feet sounded like the report of firearms, while it grew so dark that I had in certain places literally to feel my way. When about halfway through the wood, the shrubs that lined the path on either side abruptly terminate, bringing into view a circle of sward, partially covered with ferns and bracken, and having in its midst a stunted willow that has always struck me as being peculiarly out of place there. Indeed, I was pondering over this incongruity when a tall figure stalked out from behind the tree and, gliding swiftly forward, took to the path ahead of me. I rubbed my eyes and stared in amazement, and no doubt you will think me mad when I tell you the figure was nothing human. What was it, then, an anthropoid ape? My Uncle John laughed. The vicar shook his head solemnly. "I will describe it to you to the best of my ability," he said. "To begin with, it was naked, stark, staring naked." "How positively indecent," murmured Uncle John. "Really, vicar, I don't wonder you were frightened." And then the vicar continued, disregarding the interruption. "It was gray, from head to foot a uniform livid gray. A gray monstrosity. Ah, now that is interesting." I looked at my uncle quizzically. Was he still joking? But no, he was in sober earnest. Could it be possible he knew anything about the clock? I leaned back in my chair and smiled feebly. "In height," the vicar went on, "it could have been far from 7 feet, an enormous round head crowned with a black mass of shock hair, no ears, huge spider-like hands, and toeless feet. I could not see its face as its back was turned on me. Urged on by an irresistible impulse, although half dead with terror, I followed the thing. Striding noiselessly along, it left the spinney and, crossing several fields, entered your grounds by the gate in the rear of the house." "What?" my uncle roared, banging the table with his fist. "What? Do you mean to tell me you allowed it to come here?" "I couldn't stop it," the vicar said apologetically, stretching forward to help himself to some more brandy. "It led me to your summer house, vanishing through the doorway. Resolved on seeing the last, and hoping thereby to discover some clue to the mystery, I cautiously approached the window, and peering through the glass saw the creature walk stealthily across the floor and disappear into a gigantic clock. I really believed I was as much scared by the sight of that clock as I had been by the appearance of the spectre. They were both satanically awful." "Is that all?" my Uncle John inquired. It is, the vicar replied. And is it not enough? My Uncle John got to his feet. Before returning a verdict, he said, I must see the clock. Let us go to the summer house at once. The vicar and I were loud in our protest. We were sure my uncle must be tired. Better put off the investigation to the morrow. It was, however, of no avail. There was no gainsaying Uncle John when once he had made up his mind to do anything. We accordingly escorted him without delay to the garden. The clock was standing quite peacefully where I had set it. As soon as my uncle saw it, he caught hold of my arm. "Where on earth did you get it from, Harry?" he cried, bubbling over with excitement. "The last time I saw that clock was in Clog Castle, the home of the Blakes. It had been in their possession for centuries, and was made from what is supposed to be the oldest bog oak in Ireland. Ah, the old lady left it to you, did she? And you say she got it from Kelly's in Grafton Street? Come, that explains everything. The Blakes, poor beggars, were sold up last year, and Kelly, I know, were represented at the sale. But now comes the extraordinary part of the affair. The great figure of friend the vicar has just described to us tallies exactly with the phantasm that used to haunt Clog, and which the Blakes have always regarded in the light of a family ghost. Now it would appear that they were entirely wrong, that it is with the clock and not the Clegg this apparition is connected, a fact that is not at all surprising when we come to consider its origin and the vast antiquity of its frame. But let us examine it more carefully tomorrow. We did so, and discovered that the frontal pillars on either side of the face of the clock consisted of two highly polished femur bones, which, although blackened through countless ages of immersion in the bog, and abnormally long, as is inevitably the case with Paleolithic man, were very unmistakably human. I returned the clock anonymously to Kelly's.